That image there of Vice President Kamala Harris from the moment she took the stage, walking straight up to Donald Trump and introducing herself and insisting on shaking his hand, set the tone for her control of the room for the next 90 minutes, what would prove to be a powerful reminder that Donald Trump, who had 7 prior presidential debates under his belt, was immediately outmatched by Vice President Harris's talent and prosecutorial skills.
And I'm going to actually do something really unusual, and I'm going to invite you to attend one of Donald Trump's rallies, because it's a really interesting thing to watch. You will see during the course of his rallies, he talks about fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter. He will talk about windmills cause cancer. And what you will also notice is that people start leaving his rallies early out of exhaustion and boredom. And I will tell you, the one thing you will not hear him talk about is you. Donald Trump was fired by 81 million people. So let's be clear about that. And clearly he is having a very difficult time processing that. And I'm going to tell you that I have traveled the world as Vice President of the United States, and world leaders are laughing at Donald Trump. I have talked with military leaders, some of whom worked with you, and they say you're a disgrace.
Whew. By comparison, Donald Trump seemed to be undone, not only by the facts, but by some of his own words.
Now she wants to do transgender operations on illegal aliens that are in prison. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
ABC News did reach out to the city manager there. He told us there have been no credible reports of specific claims of pets being harmed, injured, or abused by individuals within the immigrant community.
Well, I've seen people on television.
Let me just say here, this is
the people on television say my dog was taken and used for food. So maybe he said that, and maybe that's a good thing to say for a city manager.
I'm not taking this from television.
But the people on television saying
manager.
They have abortion in the 9th month. He said the baby will be born and we will decide what to do with the baby. In other words, we'll execute the baby.
There is no state in this country where it is legal to kill a baby after it's born.
The New York Times, among others, offering a blistering postmortem review. Quote, from the opening moments of her first debate against Donald Trump, Kamala Harris craftily exploited her opponent's biggest weakness, not his record, not his divisive policies, not his history of inflammatory statements. Instead, she took aim at a far more primal part of him, his ego. Quote, at his rallies on his sycophantic social media network and surrounded by flatterers at Mar-a-Lago, Trump is unquestioned, unchallenged, and never, ever mocked. That changed over the course of 90 minutes in Philadelphia on Tuesday, when the woman who had never before met him succeeded bit by bit in puncturing his comfortable cocoon and triggering his annoyance and anger. Today, less than 12 hours after they walked off the debate stage, Vice President Kamala Harris and Donald Trump met again under very different, very solemn circumstances. This time it was at Ground Zero here in New York City, shaking hands again before a memorial service marking the 23rd anniversary of the terrorist attacks on September 11th. Remember, these are two people who until last night had never met because Donald Trump upended the peaceful transfer of power and refused to attend President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris's inauguration. And now, in less than 24 hours, they've come face to face twice. And if Vice President Harris has her way, they will meet again in October for a second debate, a challenge that seemed to send Donald Trump into a tailspin, with Trump telling Fox News this morning that he would, quote, be less than inclined to debate Vice President Harris again, which shouldn't come as much of a surprise after Trump's display on stage last night. We can all imagine why he might not be eager for a repeat. It's where we start today with some of our favorite experts and friends. Here with me at the table, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, the president of the National Action Network, the Reverend Al Sharpton. Also joining us, former RNC spokesman, host of the Bulwark podcast, Tim Miller's here. Sarah Longwell will join us in a couple of minutes. Rev, your thoughts now that we're at about 20 hours post.
I think that Kamala Harris, the vice president, did a masterful job. And I think she did it in a way that was so skillful, a lot of people missed it. She was able to address him and undress him in many ways, because the handshake undressed him, because here's a man who's a narcissist and a bigot and a misogynist. And now he finds himself on stage with a woman and on top of that, a black woman who already has shown, I'm not intimidated by you. I'm going to come over on your side and make you shake my hand. Is an unbelievable position for him because it means I'm literally equal to what I've always been discriminated against, blacks and women in one. It's like Hillary and Obama put together, and this is what he's dealing with. And she was very skillful in the sense that she not only opposed him, but also kept going in the same answers to the vision of America in the future. She would not just play back and forth with him. She would answer him, she would put him in his place, and then she'd say, but this is the America I believe in. I believe in you. I prosecuted for you. I've stood for you. This is where we need to go. He never got there. He never talked about a vision for America because I don't believe he has one. He never got outside of himself. She all night long said, he's this, I'm that, but here's where we need to take you. And I think that was what made her so masterful.
She got him to admit that he doesn't have a plans, just concepts. She got him to take three sides of the question, who won 2020? I mean, there were such unrealistic expectations on her last night, and she exceeded every one of them. What do you make of the fact that in this post-truth world we live in, the first reaction on Fox News for Donald Trump was to condemn his performance? I want to play a little bit of it. Let me see. I think I have Brit Hume or Bret Baier. Do we have some of the Fox React? Let's see that.
Vice President Harris was clearly well prepared, practiced on the offensive much of the night. Former President Trump did take a lot of the bait that she threw out in some of those answers.
Make no mistake about it. Trump had a bad night. He rose to the bait repeatedly when she baited him, something I'm sure his advisors had begged him not to do. And we heard so many of the old grievances that we'd long thought that Trump had learned were not winners politically. Mm-hmm. And there they all were, talking about how he didn't lose the election and all that. I mean, so my sense is that she came out of this in pretty good shape. Now, how long this will last and is anybody's guess. But for tonight, at least, this was pretty much her night.
You're saying she had a good night?
I'm saying she certainly did.
This was rough. This was pretty intense at times. She started off shaky. She regained her footing. You watch this thing, if you're a Democrat, you're like, oh, she did a great job. She was much more forceful than Joe Biden. If you're a Republican, you look at this and you're like, that's Donald Trump. He had some moments where you were like, oh, my God, where are we going with this?
Did Donald Trump miss a few opportunities? Absolutely.
I mean, the bar is so low, but that counts as like a major truth-telling moment for Fox News, right?
No, it was a major truth-telling moment, and the reality is that for you to admit the obvious, for us to have to classify it as an amazing moment shows you how it's news that they actually told the truth for a minute. I mean, how do you rationalize a man standing up there in public on national television saying that Haitians are eating cats and dogs? And the objective moderator said, we talked to the city manager who said there is no reports of any of that. I saw it on television. This man was president of the United States and asking to be president again. I mean, this is stuff you get from kids coming home from kindergarten that had read a bad comic book.
And Tim, I played that Fox sound because this is a performance by both of them from which neither can run or hide, right?
Yes.
If you watched Kamala Harris on Fox News and you thought she was pretty good, but let's see if I can obtain a permission structure from the anchors there to continue to not believe my eyes and ears, it wasn't available last night. And if you were on the fence, all 8 of you, you can trust that what you saw is what everybody saw. It feels like an important watershed moment in American politics.
Yeah, it was a rout. Kamala Harris said one of her best lines, one of my favorite lines, was that, Vladimir Putin knows that he can eat you for lunch, talking about Trump. Kamala Harris ate him for lunch last night and ate him for dinner and ate him for dessert, and she's eating him for breakfast this morning. He just got annihilated. In the spin, you were showing the Fox clips. In the spin room last night, I was in Philly, and I was walking around because unfortunately I know some of these people, the surrogates that were there for Trump, and talking to them. And I asked one question to several of them over and over. What did you think was his best moment Like, what do you think was the best answer that he gave last night? These guys couldn't come up with anything. Like, Corey Lewandowski literally was like, there were so many good answers. And this guy, David Boss, who used to be at Citizens United, said, you really put me on the spot here. They didn't have anything. Like, usually you go, hey, look, I've been in a spin room after my candidate lost a debate. And there's the thing you do, which is you pick the best thing the candidate did. And you're like, we're going to stick with that, right? We're going to be like, hey, anytime I get asked, we're like, well, what about how we really won on points on the tax cuts or whatever the issue is? They didn't have anything because on style, on substance, he was a disaster. Like every little bait that she put out, he just ate up and just filled his belly with it. His body language, if you watch the debate on mute, as bad as his words were, his body language was worse. He refused to look at her the whole time. And just look at those clips. His shoulders are hunched. He's grimacing. His voice was a little croaking at one point. And she is staring him down. You know, talk about like the alpha. We had a lot of, I remember, Nicole, back in July, we had Tim Alberta on, and we talked about how the Trump theory of the case from his team was that this was kind of a dominance race where Trump was the dominant alpha predator or whatever. He was so weak last night. She was staring him down every time he spoke. He couldn't even look her direction. He was scared to look her direction. He knew she had his number from about, I'd say, like maybe the 10-minute mark in the debate last night. So we can talk about some of the substantive development as well, but and it was horrible. There are plenty of things to talk about. There were plenty of conspiracies and lies and unpopular extreme views that he offered. But just kind of the dynamic of it sort of tells you all you need to know.
And I'll write your name.
Taylor Swift is the most popular singer on earth today. She has an impact that has really redefined what artists can do with the combined reach of music, digital streaming, global touring, and an internet following. The current and former president, just as a baseline, have about 15 to 30 million followers on Instagram. That's more than most people who use the internet. Well, they've both been president after all. Swift does not have double or triple their numbers. Taylor Swift has 10 times that. 280 million followers on Instagram, many millions more across other platforms. Her popularity and pretty golden image is in demand by basically every top entity you can think of, from the richest companies in the world like Apple, to brands like the NFL, to heads of state, to politicians. And right off top, I'll tell you, Donald Trump tried to lie his way into a Taylor alliance this year. It was just earlier in this campaign season when Donald Trump falsely claimed he had Taylor Swift's backing because he wanted it. And he thought confusing even some people about that would help him because he knows Taylor Swift is a huge deal. He posted some amateurish AI images with those false claims online. And we'll come back to that in a moment, because it hurt him. But first, the news that rocked the political and musical worlds just on debate night. Taylor Swift coming out on the big night to back the Harris-Walz ticket officially, and not just in, say, a little statement to the political press, but owning it and blasting it to all of her followers online.
The endorsement of every politician's wildest dreams, the most famous cat lady in the world.
One voter ready to speak now. Taylor Swift is now in her endorsement era. Get it?
I'm a Swiftie. Donald Trump is going to have a hard time shaking off that debate.
She has 283 million Instagram followers.
I don't think you know about this. And she says, quote, I will be casting my vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz.
I am incredibly grateful, first of all, to Taylor Swift. I say that also as a cat owner, a fellow cat owner.
I'm so tired of running as fast as I can. Would I get there faster if I were a man?
This may be a sort of door swinging open for the girl dads for Harris.
I guess I'll just stumble on home to my cats. Say I didn't warn you.
Perhaps the most anticipated and potentially most consequential presidential celebrity campaign endorsement that we've seen.
The most consequential. The running mate responding in real time. And he knows it helps the Harris-Walz ticket. Swift has turned her following into civic action before, even in far less hyped, less known races. I'll remind you about 6 years back, She supported a Democratic candidate in Tennessee, which caused voter registrations to skyrocket. Even her nonpartisan reminders and appeals that people should vote have helped surge new voter registrations, like last year. And she has even, in her own work, shared the regret she says she later felt when she sat out past races, even though her values and women's rights were on the line.
Taylor Swift comes out against Trump.
I don't care if they write that. I'm sad that I didn't 2 years ago, but I can't change that. I'm saying right now that this is something that I know is right, and you guys, I need to be on the right side of history. And if he doesn't win, then at least I tried.
The right side of history, at least I tried. A lot of people in politics could learn something from her right there. Now, Republicans and the MAGA crowd had only dialed up the pressure on Swift since then, which again is a sign they view her as a threat, as someone who can affect their power and campaigns. And right-wing voices online were taking a preemptive strike with those conspiracy theories about some Biden pact to take over the Super Bowl with a Biden-Swift endorsement deal. That did not happen, but that storyline was trying to suggest something somehow sinister about her civic role or to bully and quiet her. MAGA pundits were on the attack. The implied threat was if she imposed Trump this time, this year, her career and her life would even get worse. Some pledged a, quote, holy war against Taylor Swift if she backed the Democrats at that time when Biden was the nominee. And that brings us back to Donald Trump trying to muddy the waters with his usual playbook of lies, because he posted those false claims about the endorsement. I showed you the headlines. And so note where Taylor Swift's new Harris endorsement begins. She calls out Trump's abuse of those AI images to falsely suggest that she had somehow endorsed Trump's presidential run, and noting that he's responsible for those lies because it was posted to his site. And she begins with a clear rebuttal in this time of misinformation, which is something that people in the public eye face, her and people in politics. Quote, the simplest way to combat misinformation is with the truth. And she shares her truth, outlining her support for Harris and Walz, contrasting their calm to Donald Trump's chaos. You see, where she says there, we could be led by, quote, calm and not chaos. And I'll say something else here. I'm talking to you through TV, which is an older medium. Old school communications tend to be one way and at a distance. But the world's changing. Taylor Swift is a sophisticated leader and user of the tools today, which are far more direct, two-way, participatory. And so it's not random, but quite striking that she used a very particular message to get into the weeds of action within the same endorsement announcement, telling her huge fan base, which could include people who may not have done this before, that first-time voters have to remember, in order to vote, you have to be registered. If you'd never done it before, you might not know that. And so she is getting ahead of that in a participatory way. And then she signed off, now memorably, as a childless cat lady, a reference to J.D. Vance's sexist attack. And, of course, this post features her and her cat, which is a Swiftian twist, which makes this post even more catchy, more memeable, and also hoist Vance's infamous, stupid, misogynistic phrase on his own petard. As Swift once sang, karma's a relaxing thought. Aren't you envious that for you it's not? And that applies very clearly politically to J.D. Vance right now, the loser of this endorsement primary. Also applies to Trump backer and billionaire Elon Musk, who today responded by musing about, quote, giving Taylor Swift a child. A sexist and clearly Swift-obsessed response that shows how these men are unable to deal with her and what she does with her power. That same song actually continues. Karma is a cat purring in my lap. Me and Karma vibe like that. Well, people are vibing. Most people, when you post online, if you got a few thousand likes, you'd think that was a pretty strong post for the year. Within a day, the Harris endorsement post has topped 9 million likes and counting. Direct referrals to that voter registration site that she flagged are already topping 330,000 as of this morning for Vote.org. We'll be updating that number as it rises. That is just the overnight number. A Swift response. It could hit millions over the weeks ahead. So the Swift effect is measurable. And during the debate, They tracked this. Searches for voter reg went up, but then it tapered off as the debate wound down, as the Washington Post reports, and that's typical. But then, quote, when Swift's endorsement dropped, it jumped back up. That's remarkable. Talk about civic engagement. Those are national trends. So Taylor Swift's single endorsement post is on par with the interest that was generated by both of these super famous candidates being on stage for 90 minutes in a televised debate. So who's afraid of little old me, as Swift once asked? Well, clearly, some of those people on the right who lost this contest over her endorsement. And clearly, Trump, Vance, and Musk, and some of their bro allies who have been taught a lesson here, that all the lies, tricks, and political bullying failed. Now, we don't know what's going to happen in the election. The vote is up to you. But Taylor Swift and Kamala Harris clearly have their own stories, their own lives. They forged their own paths in very different careers and at different times. But it's worth noting that both clearly know a thing or two about breaking barriers, and after proving their work and their talents in their fields, they often run into the same old sexist disdain and disrespect from the same old haters. Well, maybe these two women also share the fortitude to shake it off and the confidence to even have fun while doing it.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame. As far as rallies are concerned, as far as the reason they go is they like what I say. They want to bring our country back. They want to make America great again. It's a very simple phrase, make America great again. She's destroying this country, and if she becomes president, this country doesn't have a chance of success. Not only success, we'll end up being Venezuela on steroids.
I just want to clarify here. You bring up Springfield, Ohio, and ABC News did reach out to the city manager there. He told us there have been no credible reports of specific claims of pets being harmed, injured, or abused by individuals within the immigrant community.
Well, I've seen people on television.
Let me just say here, this is the
people on television say my dog was taken and used for food. So maybe he said that, and maybe that's a good thing to say for a city manager.
I'm not taking this from television.
But the people
I'm
on
taking it from
television
the city
saying their
manager.
dog was eaten by the people that went there.
Again, the Springfield city manager says there's no evidence of that. Vice President Harris, I'll let you respond to the rest of what you've heard.
You talk about extreme.
One of the most talked about moments from last night's debate, the former president repeating a false, unhinged claim, which his campaign has promoted, that immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, are eating people's pets.
Eating dogs. Yeah.
And moments after the debate ended, another huge headline. One of the biggest names in music, global superstar Taylor Swift, endorses Vice President Kamala Harris.
As Churchill would say, Willie, it's not the beginning of the end, it's into the beginning. But I don't know, with Taylor, maybe it is the beginning of the end. For Donald Trump, you know, I've got to say, our job is to analyze the debate last night. But I must say that, you know, one of the phrases, the catchphrases that have come up this election cycle has been sane washing. Mm-hmm. And you have mainstream people, mainstream media people that are trying their best to mold Donald Trump into a Bob Dole-like character, somebody that they can analyze as if he's any other candidate, as if this is any other election, as if last night was any other debate. It just wasn't. You had one candidate that was completely unhinged, just completely off his rocker. Mm-hmm. He looked badly. He looked old. He looked disconnected from reality. He looked enraged. He kept repeating the same things over and over again. Made no sense. There was no preparation on his side. And he resorts to internet rumors already debunked just because he has nothing to say. One of the most ill-prepared, well, the most ill-prepared presidential candidates we have ever seen in one of these debates. One of the angriest, and I got to say, hunched over. Look at it, his eye squinting. The split screen was extraordinary. So this morning, for people on any network, even those who get paid to lie about Donald Trump every day, there's no sane washing this, and there's no normalizing this, and there's no pretending that that was any other candidate, this is any other election, or that was any other debate.
Yeah, we've been encouraging people for a long time to not grade Donald Trump on a curve, to not say, well, that's what he does. No, this guy wants to be president of the United States again. So watch that debate last night and ask yourself if that's a person who should be back in the White House, who should be near the nuclear codes. We're going to show all of these moments, but just to summarize quickly, in addition to his claim, which was made up on the internet, and by the way, the person who took the photograph of the guy carrying the goose down the street spoke out yesterday and said, that wasn't in Springfield, Ohio. I have no idea if that guy was an immigrant, if he was Haitian or anything else. So more debunking of that incredible moment yesterday when Donald Trump, former president of the United States, is screaming about people eating dogs. That didn't happen. He praised, when asked about foreign policy, praised only Viktor Orban, the authoritarian leader of Hungary. He would not say whether he wants Ukraine to win the war when asked many times. Effectively siding with Vladimir Putin there, defended his actions leading up to and on the day of January 6th, and defended the mob that desecrated the Capitol and beat up cops that day. Went back to the well, even, Joe, of defending what he did around the Central Park 5. Said, well, actually, at the time, I mean, why go back to that? He was asked about it, but why even attempt to rationalize or defend calling for the death penalty for 5 young men who ultimately were exonerated? And that was just the tip of the iceberg. So there's no more grading Donald Trump on a curve. He wants to be president of the United States again. Yeah. Watch those 90 minutes last night and ask yourself, which of those two people is more fit to be president?
And for anybody who is frustrated watching Donald Trump lie again and again unchecked, I will say that last night was validation, finally. Watching him get called out, not necessarily by the moderators, though they did make an attempt to try, although he talked over them and they didn't turn him off. But Kamala Harris was superb. She was elegant. She was classy. But she also was joyful, and then she also went right in there and baited him over and over and over again, and he fell for it every time. And I think the moment that really was the unraveling was when she invited all Americans to attend a Trump rally and to see the lies in person and to see how tired and boring the rallies are, to hear about Hannibal Lecter and other things. And he just lost it from there on. In fact, we can play that.
Let's play it real quick.
Take a look.
And I'm going to actually do something really unusual, and I'm going to invite you to attend one of Donald Trump's rallies, because it's a really interesting thing to watch. You will see during the course of his rallies, he talks about fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter. He will talk about windmills cause cancer. And what you will also notice is that people start leaving his rallies early out of exhaustion and boredom. And I will tell you, the one thing you will not hear him talk about is you. You will not hear him talk about your needs, your dreams, and your desires. And I'll tell you, I believe you deserve a president who actually puts you first, and I pledge to you that I will.
Let me respond as to the
Please.
rallies. She said people start leaving. People don't go to her rallies. There's no reason to go. And the people that do go, she's bussing them in and paying them to be there, and then showing them in a different light. So she can't talk about that. People don't leave my rallies. We have the biggest rallies, the most incredible rallies in the history of politics. That's because people want to take their country back. Our country is being lost. We're a failing nation. And it happened 3.5 years ago. And what's going on here, you're going to end up in World War III. As far as rallies are concerned, as far as the reason they go is they like what I say. They want to bring our country back. They want to make America great again. It's a very simple phrase, make America great again. She's destroying this country, and if she becomes president, this country doesn't have a chance of success. Not only success, we'll end up being Venezuela on steroids.
And from there on out, Joe, it just went downhill for him. He could not handle hearing that his rallies are boring and that people get up and leave.
You know, Willie, it's interesting that when you're listening to music and you're trying to really figure out what's going on in a performance, it really is always best. Quincy Jones would always tell people, if you want to know what's going on, turn your back to who's performing, or just close your eyes. That's how you hear the music. Here, I would say just the opposite. If you want to get exactly where a debate's going, turn the sound off. Use your eyes. And visually, the split screens are so stark. When you do that, you see Kamala Harris smiling, mocking, putting her hand underneath her chin, going, "Are you really saying that?" And at one moment in that bizarre exchange about dog eating, she actually looked like she was feeling sorry for the man because he was so detached from reality.
Yeah, I mean, he wouldn't look at her. I mean, if you go through those 90 minutes, you probably count two or three times when he even glanced over. Yeah, he's scowling, he's uncomfortable. And I think, John, one of the big tells, and we've heard from a lot of Republicans who concede privately that this went just terribly for Donald Trump. And actually, I heard some praise for Kamala Harris's performance, even from Republicans. Democrats obviously excited about it. Was about 30 minutes into the debate, we started to see online and now on the front page of a major newspaper that it was the moderators' fault. Blame the moderators. They're ganging up because a handful of times they fact-checked Donald Trump on egregious lies. You also know that it didn't go well because Donald Trump showed up in the spin room. Donald Trump himself last night after the debate, to try to sort of reimagine what happened in that room last night. The Harris campaign calling immediately for a second debate. We'll see if there is a second debate. They feel confident about it. The Trump campaign resorting to blaming the moderators for what their candidate did in that room.
Yeah, if you're showing up in the spin room, you've lost. If you're blaming the moderators, you've lost. And Trump, we should note, was non-committal about whether he would debate Harris again. The Harris team very much say, hey, let's get a second date on the books for October. The split screen, as noted, was so effective for Harris. The way she smiled and sort of almost mocked him at times, just looking in disbelief. I can't believe I'm sharing the stage with someone who's saying things like that. And she threw him off right at the beginning. She walked over for that handshake. He clearly didn't expect it. That set a tone for the night. The first 15, 20 minutes, relatively even when they talked about the economy. But once we went to the crowd size, once they started talking about abortion, which was an issue that Trump twisted himself in knots and to try to explain his shifting stances, but at the same time made clear that he was proud of the Supreme Court justices that he nominated that overturned Roe v. Wade before falsely claiming that all Americans wanted the issue settled by the states, and the vice president scored some points there. And there were so many moments here where she just got the best of him, and he looked old, he looked out of touch. And he looked like he was speaking, Joe, to just a small Republican ecosystem, not winning over any new votes at all.
That's what's so bizarre.
And we should note, it took a while to get there last night, but he was asked. Not just about January 6th, where he defended his actions, but he was asked about the 2020 election. And he repeatedly would not say that he lost.
And by the way, for people, again, that have to lie constantly, trying to normalize Donald Trump, there's so much they can't run away from. You know, his own campaign staff begging him to stop lying about a stolen election. He couldn't do it. He could not say that he wanted Ukraine to be able to push back the Russian invaders. Would not say it. He would not say repeatedly whether he was going to push a national ban for abortion on American women. Would not say it. Was asked afterwards as he was leaving debate. He would not answer that question on whether he supported a national ban or not. You go down the list. He time and time again would not say he did anything wrong on January 6th. Again, there was nothing normalized about him. His performance was absolutely terrible. And there were many people who actually dared to say the truth. It was the worst debate performance in history. And you had a lot of Trump supporters on Twitter, in the media, saying it was one of the worst debate performances they ever saw. And they could blame ABC all they wanted to. Blaming those two? You can't get past that?
No.
Seriously? I mean, is he that bad? He's going to take on dictators all over the world and can't handle the truth about eating cats in Springfield, Ohio? I mean, seriously.
Right out of the box on Fox News, Brit Hume said she won, hands down. There's no other way to look at it. Others tried to make up stuff, but there was nowhere to go.
They have nothing.
Also,
yeah, Chuck, and I was just thinking about just the experience I've had with you over the years. I mean, I remember we were at that town hall that we carried out in Las Vegas with Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and later, of course, the first Democratic presidential debates in 2020 season. Those were 10 candidates. What do you think was missing as far as just structure of debates?
Well, it's hard to structure when Donald Trump's involved, in fairness to the debate moderators. Do I wish there was sort of like, okay, we're going to focus on this issue, yeah, I do. But again, as much as I could sit here and say, well, I'd have done it this way. Donald Trump is this sort of, he's just somebody that brings chaos to a situation. So I think any other set of candidates, you would have wanted a more structured environment. You'd have probably wanted, okay, let's spend the first 10 minutes on inflation. Let's spend the next 10 minutes on the border. Let's spend the next 10 minutes on reproductive rights. But that's just not something that you do, that we've been doing in the world of Donald Trump. And I think that's the challenge in putting on any event that includes Donald Trump in it.
Yeah, and Alessia, what stood out to you from last night's debate?
Listen, so many things stood out to me. Vice President Harris looked very presidential, but she commanded that stage last night. And not only the way that she delivered her vision for the future of America, this opportunity economy that is inclusive of everyone, even the way that she non-verbally showed up. She commanded the stage and the viewers from the moment she walked in, and actually forced Donald Trump into shaking her hand. And, the thing I appreciated is that what she was saying was her vision for America. She was talking about the plans around the economy, around abortion access, and yet her nonverbal communication is what showed us her reaction to Donald Trump. So she was able to speak to us in two ways. I do think that Donald Trump was extremely rattled, right? At one point, he was the disruptive candidate, I would say in a negative way, the disruptive candidate in our presidential politics. But Vice President Harris showed that she is actually the one that is disrupting this notion of who should be in leadership, who should be in power. And the reality is she has this broad coalition that she was able to speak to, all the way from, progressive left to Republicans who are tired of Donald Trump. And so I appreciated the way that she held her own in the debate. And I also appreciate the monitors for correcting the record on some of the outlandish things that he was saying, particularly about eating dogs and cats. And it was really helpful to see that, the two contrasts and the two choices that the American people have in the upcoming election.
Yeah, John, you've been on, both sides of the debate stage, right? And I'm just thinking what Alessia's talking about. I mean, just the fact that you have to sit there and discuss whether people are eating dogs or not is just mind-blowing, but it's what it is. And I'm just thinking, what did you take away from the debate, John?
Well, I think it's a matter of who gains. So did Donald Trump gain? Of course not. He didn't gain last night. He was sort of a darkness that surrounded him, and the comments about, eating dogs or whatever. I mean, just only out of Trump, right? And sort of diminishes, the former president. I mean, the presidency itself. I get nervous about that. But she definitely gained. And I agree with Chuck from the standpoint of she's gained, but she's going to have to do a lot more. Now the question is, it's a follow-up. She's going to, I believe, has to sit for some more in-depth interviews, but she definitely put herself in a position where she can be viewed as a president. And she was very stable. She did a good job. But not as many specifics as you would like, not enough explanation for some of her switches in order to get people who are these undecided voters out there. So remember, Trump's got his people and she's got her people, and it's that fight for that percentage that's still on the fence. And I think that the more she can appear, people will get more and more comfortable. She now can win this election without doubt.
And Alencia, one of the things she was very specific on, clear and concise, is her attempts to hold the former president accountable for the patchwork of abortion laws across the country. Take a listen to this.
You want to talk about this is what people wanted? Pregnant women who want to carry a pregnancy to term, suffering from a miscarriage, being denied care in an emergency room because the healthcare providers are afraid they might go to jail, and she's bleeding out in a car in the parking lot. She didn't want that. Her husband didn't want that. A 12 or 13-year-old survivor of incest being forced to carry a pregnancy to term. They don't want that.
Alencia, how do you think voters saw this?
Well, listen, as someone who has worked in the reproductive freedom movement, I worked at Planned Parenthood. She has been a champion even before she became senator, when she was attorney general. And voters are listening. They remember those stories. And it's not just Democratic women. It's not just independent women, but even Republican women who are trying to find a home can hear themselves in that conversation. And so I do want to push back on this notion where everyone is talking about Vice President Harris didn't give specifics. She gave numbers around the policies that she is believing will help the economy. She also talked about abortion access. And if she wasn't talking about policy, she was humanizing the issue. And it is really challenging that Donald Trump doesn't get the same smoke from the media and people who are saying that they want to hear more from Vice President Harris when he has never rolled out any policies. But he has, cozied up with the people who created Project 2025, who are going to have people monitoring women for the decisions about their bodies. And so Vice President Harris is giving us specifics. And it feels very much that the bar is higher for her, given that she's a woman. And yet Donald Trump, the bar is so low that he just gets to skate on by with no specifics at all. He does a lot of media interviews, but again, doesn't give specifics. She does one major media interview, gives specifics, gives them at her rallies. She's completely disciplined. And so we saw that again last night. And I need for the people who are paying attention to this election to start actually thinking critically, why aren't we asking Donald Trump the same questions about specifics that we are demanding of her?
Well, and, Chuck, one issue where Trump couldn't give any specifics is if he'd veto a national abortion ban, for example, if it reached his desk, if reelected. Here's part of that.
Would you veto a national abortion ban if it came to your desk?
Well, I won't have to.
If I could just get a yes or no, because your running mate, J.D. Vance, has said that you would veto it if it did come to your desk.
Well, I didn't discuss it with J.D. In all fairness, J.D., and I don't mind if he has a certain view, but I think he was speaking for me, but I really didn't. Look, we don't have to discuss it.
Chuck, what's the theory or the political, focus on this?
Look, I would just want to step back because the moment, I think that moment captured why Joe Biden couldn't beat Donald Trump and why Kamala Harris can. Joe Biden couldn't utter the word abortion, couldn't say it, couldn't talk about it. She put it in personal terms. She humanized it. And then she did a little bit of branding, which we're normally used to the right being very successful at, and started calling them the Trump abortion bans around the states. And that has the potential to be sticky. I think of all of the back and forth, this was the most substantive. And this was a reminder, I think, why so many Democrats were convinced Biden didn't have what it took to win this campaign, because you needed to make reproductive rights among the front and center issues. He was uncomfortable speaking about it. You could tell. I mean, I'm just thinking about just the anecdote she shared. Joe Biden never would have been able to bring himself to share that anecdote. On the specific, I cannot believe among the biggest unforced errors of the night was Trump's not letting that hang out there that he would not veto an abortion ban. Frankly, it's sort of a cheap way out for him. It could have been an easy way out for him to continue to muddle his position. And it's such a head scratcher considering where he was 10 days ago when It looked like he was trying to figure out how to come out against or how to come out for the abortion amendment in reproductive rights amendment in Florida. And then suddenly his campaign team said, all your volunteers are going to quit overnight if you do this. So then he reversed course. I think that moment and his inability to promise he would ban an abortion ban, he would veto an abortion ban. I think you're going to see that in more ads than anything else from that debate.
Yeah, and John, before we go, just here, if you could put into some kind of context, this whole issue, you know, you're from Ohio, right? And this whole the thing that the former president went on and on about, that migrants are eating people's pets.
Look, I think there's an extremism here on immigration that is just, it's not, frankly, part of what the culture of America's been. And, I mean, he's trying to stoke everybody's fears. It's part of the reason why I've never been a fan. It's this divisive nature that if I can lay this out and scare people, then we can make these folks who come here the enemy. We all know the border needs to be secured. We know that. But we also know that we've had a history of allowing immigrants to come into our country legally. In fact, when I was governor, I said, look, if anybody wants to come here who's an immigrant, we want you to come here. We want you to be part of our economy, be part of our culture, of our society. So I think this is some extreme way to try to frighten people. And those claims to me, when I heard it, I just couldn't believe it. My wife was in another room, and she was like, what is going on here? It's this effort to just demonize anybody who comes into this country. And I think that's a sad state of affairs.